The two rumors hit the internet before the champagne from our wedding reception had even gone flat. By sunrise, they were not just rumors. They were accepted truths, carved into the public consciousness by the relentless chisel of social media. The first, that I, Ilara Vance, a woman from a respectable but modest family, had trapped the illustrious Julian Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood Group empire. I'd allegedly gotten pregnant on purpose, using a baby as a ladder to climb into the gilded cage of the city's elite. The second rumor was more precise, a dagger aimed straight at the heart of our marriage. That Julian, my new husband, had once made a grand, passionate confession of love to the rising starlet Celeste Devereaux. The narrative was clear. I was the tacky, low-class gold digger who had shattered a fairy tale romance between a prince and his starlet. The phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, an angry hornet I refused to acknowledge. I could picture the headlines. Ilara Vance, the social climber who stole a billionaire. Julian Blackwood's true love, Celeste heartbroken. They said I brought nothing to the table, that my family's alliance with the Blackwoods was a pittance, that I was only a disruptive force. I sat in the cavernous silence of our new penthouse, the one Julian had chosen as our love nest. The air still smelled faintly of the thousands of white roses from the ceremony. Just yesterday Julian had stood at the altar, his hands trembling as he slid the emerald-cut diamond onto my finger. His voice had been thick with emotion, his eyes glistening with tears he couldn't quite blink away as he vowed, "Until death do us part." Our story was one of a decade-long friendship that had blossomed into love, a partnership built on shared history and mutual respect. Or so I had believed. Now the man in those viral photos, the one gazing adoringly at Celeste at some charity gala a year ago, felt like a stranger. The comment section was a brutal chorus. Julian must be blind. How could he give up a talent like Celeste for that nobody? She's probably crying into her prenup right now. I wasn't crying. I was numb, a statue frozen in the aftermath of an explosion. The logical part of my brain, the part one relied on to navigate the complex social dynamics of the world Julian inhabited, was whirring. This wasn't a random leak. The Blackwood Group had a vice-like grip on the media. For a story this damaging to break on my wedding night, and with such coordinated force, it had to have been allowed. Or worse, orchestrated. The memory of Julian leaving the reception surfaced, a shard of ice in the numbness. He'd kissed my forehead, a dry, perfunctory gesture. "Be good and wait for me at home, my love," he'd murmured, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. "I have some urgent business to clear up. I'll bring you roses." He'd promised me white roses, a symbol of a new beginning. Driven by a desperate need to cling to normalcy, I had decided to make him dinner. Sweet and sour fish, a dish he'd begged me to make for weeks. It was a messy, complicated recipe, one I'd never attempted before. The kitchen looked like a war zone. Fish scales glittered on the countertops, and the air was heavy with the tang of vinegar and scorched sugar. Took me 3 attempts, 3 ruined batches before I produced something edible. My pinky finger throbbed where a fishbone had pricked me, a tiny, stinging betrayal. I set the table with our finest china, lit candles and waited. The afternoon light faded into the deep indigo of evening, and then into the oppressive black of midnight. The fish was reheated so many times it had begun to disintegrate, the crispy batter turning to a sad, soggy mush. The candles burned down to stubs, dripping wax onto the polished table like frozen tears. The roses never came. Instead, the giant flat-screen TV blared a news segment, seemingly on a loop, detailing Julian's past extravagance towards Celeste. Custom-made performance costumes, a hired dance crew that cost a fortune, even an investment in a reality show just to feature her. The program spliced clips of their bizarre love triangle, painting our marriage as a joke, a transaction never taken seriously by anyone. Then a flicker of light outside the floor-to-ceiling window. A glint, poorly hidden. Camera lens. The paparazzi had staked out the penthouse. Of course they had. They were here for one thing, to capture the new Mrs. Blackwood in her most pathetic state, waiting like a discarded doll for a husband who had already moved on. At exactly 11 p.m. a knock finally came. My heart, foolish thing that it was, leapt into my throat. I smoothed my dress, forced my face into a mask of soft, hopeful expectation and rushed to the door. It wasn't Julian. It was his assistant, Liam, a man I had personally recommended for the job 2 years ago. He stood there looking profoundly uncomfortable, a thick creamy envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Alara Liam." "It's still Alara," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. He flinched. "Alara. Julian asked me to deliver this." He held out the envelope. As if it were an afterthought or perhaps a preemptive strike, he produced a check from his breast pocket. "And this?" My eyes dropped to the check. $60 million. The number swam before my eyes. Then, as if on cue, the TV chimed with a breaking news alert. Rising star Celeste Devereaux spotted checking into the exclusive Orchid Hotel, a Blackwood property, sweetly accompanied by second son Julian Blackwood. A photograph filled the screen. Julian, his hand possessively on the small of Celeste's back, guiding her through a private entrance. The timing was impeccable. A masterpiece of public humiliation. I looked from the check to the envelope, understanding dawning. A divorce agreement. On my wedding night. Tears, hot and immediate, sprang to my eyes. They were not entirely fake. The shock, the utter demolition of my reality was real. I let them flow, making sure my cheeks were glistening under the hallway light for the benefit of any hidden cameras. My hands trembled as I took the envelope and the check. "Thank you, Liam," I whispered, my voice breaking on a sob. Then, mustering all the strength I had left, I quietly closed the door in his face. I heard his muffled voice through the solid oak. "Mrs. Blackwood. Lara, you and Julian have been together for so long. Everyone at the company respects you. Maybe you can still talk this out." I leaned against the door, the cold wood a shock against my back. "Thank you. I'm okay," I called out, making sure my voice wavered convincingly. I waited until I heard the elevator ding and his footsteps fade away. Then I walked to the window. The wind stirred the sheer curtains, lifting strands of my hair. I covered my face with my hands, my shoulders shaking with the force of my sobs. I made sure the silhouette was perfect. A heartbroken woman, shattered by betrayal. What the cameras couldn't see was the calculation behind my tears. My family, the Vances, might not have the Blackwoods' billions, but we were old money, respectable. We were never the kind to use a baby to secure a marriage. This was a targeted attack. First, the pregnancy lie to discredit me. Then, the paparazzi to document my downfall. And Julian? He was probably with his mistress, letting me take the full force of the public's ridicule. It was a dangerous game. My acting had to be flawless. I was almost out of fake tears. The headlines the next morning were exactly as I predicted. A grainy long-lens photo of me crying at the window was splashed across every tabloid. "The lonely bride," they called me. Humiliated Alara's wedding night vigil. By mid-morning, the Blackwood family elders were at my parents' doorstep, their faces grim with apology. The machinery of damage control was whirring to life. And by lunchtime, Julian was dragged back to the penthouse by his older brother Alexander Blackwood. I was in the kitchen attempting to make soup dumplings when they arrived. Alexander, ever the diplomat, was oozing sincerity. "Alara, my dear sister-in-law," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "The netizens are fools. They are easily manipulated. We failed to manage public opinion. I am truly sorry. These celebrities, they love to stir up drama, but it's all in the past now. Don't let it affect your future with Julian." He presented me with a folder. A small token of our apology. "The lease contracts for those storefronts on Oak Avenue you've been admiring." I accepted the folder with a quiet, dignified nod. I could see the amusement lurking behind Alexander's concerned facade. He found this whole situation entertaining. After a few more hollow platitudes, he made a hasty exit, leaving me alone with my husband. Julian stood by the couch, looking not contrite but thoroughly annoyed. As if I were the one who had caused this inconvenience. He didn't look like the man who had wept at our altar. This man had cold, distant eyes. "I didn't avoid coming home last night on purpose," he began, his tone defensive. "Celeste was terrified when that story broke. You have to understand, her career is just taking off. He's fragile. Scared to death of this kind of scandal." I kept my back to him, focusing on kneading the dough for the dumplings, getting the water-to-flour ratio just right. "The decision to divorce was mine," he continued, a note of impatience creeping in. "There's nothing between us now. Don't take your anger out on her." When I remained silent, his temper finally snapped. He slammed his palm down on the marble countertop, making the teacups rattle. Is 60 million not enough for you? If you have other demands, just say them. As long as you let me go. My hands stilled in the dough. A dull, familiar ache bloomed in my chest. 10 years. 10 years of friendship, of love, of building a life together. And now he was bargaining for his freedom as if I were a business obstacle. He looked at me and his expression shifted to one of strange, almost prophetic certainty. Elara, he said, his voice dropping. Something happened to me yesterday. After I left the reception, I fell. And when I got up, I remembered. Everything. I finally turned to look at him, my face a carefully constructed mask of confusion. A past life, he declared, his eyes burning with a fervent light. In that life I married you. But when the company fell into crisis, you betrayed me. You turned to another man. It was Celeste who stood by me. And when I tried to save the company, you refused to sell your shares. You sabotaged me. You fled the country. And Celeste, my Celeste, she was killed by creditors you sent after her. He spoke with unwavering conviction, painting me as a villainous, greedy monster and Celeste as his martyred angel. He was so sure of his distorted truth. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that the heavens hadn't only given him a second chance. They had given one to me too. And I remembered everything. The silence after Julian's declaration stretched, thick and heavy as the summer humidity outside. I turned back to my dough, pressing the heels of my hands into the soft, pliable mass. Each push was a methodical suppression of the fury threatening to erupt. He stood there waiting for a reaction, shock, denial, tears. He expected the Elara he thought he knew, the loyal, sometimes naive woman who trusted him implicitly. He had no idea he was speaking to a ghost, a woman who had already lived through the hell he was so desperately trying to avoid. A past life, I repeated, my voice flat, devoid of the emotion he was searching for. I kept my eyes on my hands, watching the pale dough fold and yield. That's quite a story, Julian. He mistook my calm for disbelief. I knew you wouldn't believe me, he said, a hint of that familiar arrogance returning. But I can prove it. I remember things. For example, last night. You tried to make the sweet and sour fish. You failed twice. On the second try you pricked your finger with a fishbone. On your left pinky. My hands stilled. He was right. A tiny bandage was still wrapped around the finger. A cold dread, entirely separate from the anger, trickled down my spine. He really did have memories. But they were his memories, seen through a filter of self-pity and blame. And my brother, he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the door Alexander had just exited. He just offered you the leases for the storefronts on Oak Avenue, didn't he? The ones you've been coveting for months. In my memory, he offered those as a consolation prize then too. I didn't confirm or deny. I simply listened, my mind racing, assembling the pieces of this terrifying new puzzle. He had been given a glimpse of the future, but it was a funhouse mirror version, distorted by his own failings. In his mind, he was the tragic hero and I was the architect of his ruin. The truth, the memory that had flooded back to me the moment I saw the divorce agreement in Liam's hand, was a different story altogether. It started not with a fall but with a slow, creeping chill. The Blackwood Group's crisis hadn't appeared overnight. I saw the signs long before Julian would admit them. I was the one who had spent nights buried in financial reports, my stomach churning as I traced the paths of risky investments he had authorized without full board approval. When the crash came, it was swift and brutal. And where was Julian? Paralyzed by pride, refusing to admit vulnerability. I hadn't run to another man. I had gone to an old university friend, Matthias, whose family funds specialized in corporate turnarounds. It was a desperate, humiliating plea for a lifeline. I had swallowed my pride for him, for the company we had built together. But when Julian found out I'd met with Matthias privately, he didn't see a wife fighting to save his legacy. He saw an opportunity to shift blame. "You're already looking for your next meal ticket, aren't you?" he had sneered, his eyes full of a venom I didn't recognize. And the shares? The shares he claimed I refused to sell out of spite? I had fought tooth and nail to block a hostile takeover by a rival conglomerate that would have asset stripped the company and fired thousands. Selling my stake would have given them controlling interest. My refusal was an act of preservation, not sabotage. But to a man drowning in his own failure, Any lifeline thrown to others looks like an anchor tied to his feet. The most grotesque distortion was Celeste's death. The image was seared into my memory with painful clarity. I had come home early from a futile trip to Singapore, where I'd been trying to secure a deal to stabilize our Asian holdings. It was my birthday. All I wanted was to hear his voice. I called him repeatedly, only to be met with the impersonal click of his voicemail. I found them not in a hotel but in our home in our bed. The confrontation was ugly. Julian, cornered and panicking, had shoved Celeste away from him as she tried to cling to his arm. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the top step of the grand staircase. The sound of her fall was a series of sickening cracks that still echoed in my nightmares. She died instantly. Julian's white moonlight, extinguished by his own hand. He had rewritten history. In his new narrative he was the victim and I was the monster. The unwavering conviction in his voice was what truly broke the last fragile thread holding my heart together. It wasn't just that he wanted to leave. It was that the 10 years we shared, the struggles, the laughter, the quiet moments, they meant absolutely nothing. They were so easily overwritten by a fiction that absolved him of all guilt. "You're silent," Julian observed, his voice pulling me back to the present. He sounded uneasy, as if my lack of hysterics was unnerving him. "You think I'm crazy?" I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. I allowed a sheen of tears to glass over my eyes, not of heartbreak but of a profound, weary disappointment. "I think you believe what you're saying," I said softly. "And if you believe it that strongly, then there's no point in fighting, is there?" His shoulders relaxed slightly. He saw my resignation as surrender. "So you'll sign the agreement?" Just then his phone rang, shattering the tense quiet. He glanced at the screen, and a flicker of panic crossed his face before he schooled his features into neutrality. He answered hurriedly, turning away from me. But the penthouse was too quiet, too acoustically perfect. A woman's voice, artificially sweet and laced with faux anxiety, filled the space between us. It was Celeste. "Julian, I'm so sorry to bother you again. I know this is a terrible time. I thought you had the right to know. I'm pregnant." Pregnant. The word hung in the air, stark and brutal. So soon? In our previous life, their affair had been a slow burn, hidden for years. This was different. Bolder. The timeline had accelerated, fueled by Julian's newfound memories, and his desire to rewrite his destiny immediately. I watched the color drain from Julian's face. He was embarrassed, but his voice when he spoke was gentle, reassuring. "Shoo, it's okay. Don't cry. We'll figure this out. I'll take care of everything." A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, rolled through me. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He had just finished painting her as a fragile victim in his tragic past life story, and here she was, the so-called innocent flower, already pregnant with his child. It was all so sordid. He ended the call and turned back to me, his expression a mixture of defiance and shame. "Well," I said, my voice cold and flat, cutting through his attempted explanation. "We've only been married for one day and you've already gotten your mistress pregnant. That must be a new record even for you." He flinched. "She's not the mistress. I'll be with her officially after the divorce. Besides, we'd already decided to separate before I knew. So it's not technically cheating." The logic was so absurd it was almost funny. "So, as long as you decide to break up before you get caught, it doesn't count? How remarkably convenient for you." I wiped my flour-dusted hands on a towel, a gesture of finality. "Bring the agreement over. I'll sign it. Let's get this over with." He looked strangely unsettled by my swift, clean acquiescence. He had expected a fight, tears, negotiations. He had prepared for a battle and I was simply opening the gates. It robbed him of his victory. As he retrieved the documents, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message. My own phone, lying on the counter, lit up simultaneously. A message from an unknown number. An ultrasound image. A tiny, grainy bean with a flickering heartbeat. I didn't accept the friend request, but the image was already saved. Evidence. Solid, undeniable evidence of Celeste's pregnancy. I looked at Julian, who was staring at his own screen, a complex mix of emotions on his face. Fear, possessiveness, a twisted sort of pride. In that moment, the final piece of my plan clicked into place. Julian saw himself as the hero of his own story, armed with the knowledge of the future. But his knowledge was flawed, his arrogance his greatest weakness. And he had just handed me the key to his destruction. His desperate need to be with Celeste. I signed the divorce agreement with a steady hand, choosing the liquid assets, the 60 million, and deliberately foregoing the company shares he expected me to fight for. His eyes widened with surprise and a flicker of relief. He thought he was getting the better deal. He thought he was keeping his precious company safe from my clutches. Consider it a souvenir, I said, taking the check. A token of our 10 years. He had the nerve to look gracious. Alara, we can still be friends. I didn't answer. I simply turned, walked to the bedroom and began packing a single suitcase. An idiot, even if reborn 100 times, was still an idiot. And there was no place for a nearly bankrupt ex-husband in my future. The marriage ended as quickly as it had begun. The news broke quietly, a footnote to the larger scandal of Julian and Celeste. The narrative was set. I was the pitiable ex-wife, cast aside for a newer, shinier model. I let them believe it. Let Julian have his illusion of control. Let him think he had won. Because I knew something he didn't. The financial collapse he remembered was still coming. And this time he was steering the ship directly into the storm, blinded by the false lighthouse of his memories. And I was already building my own ark. As I zipped up the suitcase, my phone rang. It was my sister Lena. Her voice was tight with fury and concern. Alara? My God, are you okay? The things they're saying. Julian is taking that woman to the Chamber of Commerce gala tonight. It's like he's stomping on your face all over again. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back had dry eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Let him, I said, my voice calm. I'm not going to the gala, Lena. I'm going to the airport. The airport? Where are you going? Singapore, I replied, picking up my suitcase and my passport. It's time to build something of my own. The hum of the Airbus A350 was a lullaby of escape. As the city of my ruin shrunk to a mere constellation of lights below, I felt not a pang of loss, but the thrilling weight of severance. The pressurized cabin was a cocoon, sealing me away from the toxic atmosphere of gossip and betrayal. I was airborne, and with every foot of altitude gained, the chains of being Mrs. Julian Blackwood fell away. Lena's words echoed in the quiet. That little actress is determined to make a scene tonight. Everyone's already talking about it. I could picture it perfectly. Julian, playing the defiant hero, parading Celeste on his arm, a living, breathing insult to me and to the Blackwood family's attempts at decorum. He would be stoic, she would be radiantly, fragilely brave. They would feed the media beast exactly what it wanted. A modern fairy tale with me cast as the wicked stepmother conveniently written out of the story. A small, cold smile touched my lips. Let them have their night. Let them bask in the flashbulbs. While they were playing their parts in that gilded theater, I was en route to the real stage where power was built and fortunes were forged. Singapore Changi Airport was a monument of serene efficiency, a world away from the chaotic emotional battleground I had left. The air was warm and carried the scent of orchids and clean, polished surfaces. I moved through the crowds with a single suitcase, my hair tied back in a severe ponytail, my posture radiating a purpose that had been absent for months. I might have been a fool for love, but I was never poor and I was never without a plan. Even in the depths of my previous life devotion, I had carved out a niche of my own, building international business deals that were the envy of the Blackwood Group's old guard. Now that knowledge was my greatest asset. I didn't bother with a hotel. From the airport, I went straight to a prearranged meeting with a real estate agent in District 10, the most coveted school district in the city-state. The sun was fierce, glinting off the glass and steel of the towering condominiums. The asking price is quite firm, Ms. Vance, the agent said, a sheen of sweat on his brow as we stood on the balcony of a sprawling, empty penthouse. The view was breathtaking, overlooking the botanical gardens. I don't care about the price, I said, my voice even. I need a property here. This one will do. Draw up the papers. The agent blinked, startled by the lack of negotiation. This wasn't an impulsive purchase. It was a strategic move. In my past life, I had learned a crucial piece of information too late. Anthony Anson, a legendary figure in the Hong Kong finance world, was planning to relocate his family to Singapore. After a stellar career in venture capital in the US, he had quietly exited his firm and returned to Asia. The public reason was vague, but I knew the truth. He was house hunting in District 10 for his youngest son's schooling. The last time I had met Anson, he was already managing a billion-dollar private equity firm. I had spent a fortune and called in every favor I had just to get a 15-minute meeting, which he'd spent mostly looking at his watch. Now I had a chance to meet him not as a supplicant but as a neighbor. Proximity was my advantage and I intended to claim it. The next few days were a whirlwind of purposeful activity. I established a shell company, Ethelred Holdings, a name plucked from a history book, meaningless and untraceable. I hired a small, discreet legal and accounting team. I was laying the groundwork, brick by careful brick. A week after my arrival, my phone buzzed. It was Lena, her face pixelated with fury on the video call. "You're not going to believe this." Ryan ignored the family's backlash and brought her. She performed. She played the freaking piano and sang some weepy ballad, and he walked up to her with a bouquet of roses. Roses, Alara. And pulled her into his arms in front of everyone. The media is calling it the grand gesture. I had to leave. I couldn't sit there and listen to them gush. I was in my new, sparsely furnished apartment, surrounded by blueprints and financial reports. I took a sip of water. "What are you so mad about?" I asked, a genuine smile playing on my lips. "My baby's about to be born too." Lena's jaw dropped. She stared at me through the screen, her anger replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. "What?" she gasped. "Alara, you didn't go and do something crazy, did you? Please tell me you're not pregnant." I laughed, a real free sound that surprised even me. Outside my window, the Singapore skyline began to glitter as dusk fell. "Not that kind of baby," I said. "The Ethelred Night Market Fund. It's my precious baby. Will be officially licensed in about 6 months. And I believe the fund manager I'm about to hire is going to deliver outstanding returns." I had set my sights on Anson. The house purchase had worked. Our paths crossed in the building's gym 2 days later. He was a man in his late 40s with a quiet intensity and the lean physique of a long-distance runner. I didn't fawn. I didn't pitch. I simply introduced myself as his new neighbor, made a casual comment about the challenges of international school admissions, and offered a contact I had from my previous life's research. It was a gesture of useful, no-strings-attached kindness. A week after that, I invited him and his wife Angela for coffee. Angela was a sharp, elegant woman with a perceptive gaze. This time I pitched. I laid out my vision for Ethelred Holdings, not with the desperation of my past life, but with the cool confidence of a fellow investor. I spoke of emerging markets in Southeast Asia, of tech infrastructure plays that were still under the radar. I didn't ask him for a job. I offered him a partnership. The freedom to build something from the ground up with my capital and his genius. "You have a remarkable grasp of the landscape, Miss Vance," Anson said, his eyes assessing me. "It's unexpected." "Life has a way of teaching unexpected lessons, Mr. Anson," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Meanwhile, the news feeds from home were a constant, grimly satisfying scroll of Julian's unfolding hubris. Using his memories from our past life, he was sidestepping certain business traps, which gave him a temporary aura of invincibility. He began a ruthless overhaul of the Blackwood Group, firing managers he remembered as disloyal, shutting down divisions he deemed inefficient. He was like a man following a treasure map without understanding the terrain, blindly confident that each avoided pitfall proved his brilliance. He announced a bold new strategy, scaling back the core jewelry business to launch his own investment firm, Blackwood Ventures. He held press conferences, his eyes blazing with the fervor of a prophet. He guaranteed the board that within 5 years, Blackwood Ventures would generate 60% of the group's total profits. The business media ate it up. Julian Blackwood, the scorned healer transforming a legacy empire. I read these articles with a detached sense of irony. He was trying to replicate my path from our first life, the path where I had saved his company through shrewd investments. But he was doing it with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He was hoarding cash, waiting for the sure things he remembered, the tech startups that would go public and multiply in value. He was so focused on the big flashy scores that he was ignoring the fundamental health of the company. The engine was being stripped for parts to fuel a rocket he didn't know how to launch. My sister called again, her voice laced with anxiety. "Have you seen what Julian's doing? People are calling him a visionary." He's making you look like dead weight he wisely jettisoned. Lena, I said calmly, looking out at the relentless, productive energy of the city below. A man who thinks he can see the future is a man who stops looking at the present. He's building a house on a foundation of sand, and he's too busy admiring the view to feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. My own foundation, meanwhile, was being poured from reinforced concrete. Anson formally agreed to come on board as the fund manager for Ethelred. The paperwork was signed in my austere new office. I used the excuse of no longer needing a school district home post-divorce to sell him the District 10 penthouse for a fraction of its value. In return, he agreed to terms that were far more favorable than any major firm could have offered him. It was a masterstroke of mutual benefit, disguised as a friendly gesture. The day the deal was finalized, Anson looked at me, his expression one of sincere gratitude. "Ms. Vance, I want to thank you again. For your trust." "There's no need to thank me, Anthony," I said, smiling. "Perhaps it's simply fate. How is your son settling in at the new school?" As we spoke of his family, I thought of Julian, who was probably in a boardroom somewhere, arrogantly dismissing concerns about cash flow. A man I had once spent a fortune to meet for 15 minutes was now my trusted partner. And the man for whom I had once moved heaven and earth was rapidly becoming a cautionary tale in the making. That night, as fireworks exploded over Marina Bay, celebrating some national holiday, Lena video called me. The colorful bursts lit up her awestruck face. "It's beautiful there," she whispered. "It is," I agreed, lifting a glass of champagne in a silent toast. To my new life, to my new baby, and to the beautiful, devastating ruin that was steadily approaching Julian Blackwood. The game was afoot, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes I was holding all the best cards. For 6 months, I built my life in Singapore with the quiet, relentless focus of a master craftsman. Ethelred Holdings, my baby, was no longer just a concept. It was a sleek, functioning machine housed in a glass-walled office with a view that stretched to the sea. Anthony Anson proved worth every ounce of trust one had placed in him. His network was impeccable, his instincts sharper than I remembered. We moved with a stealth that belied our growing power, acquiring stakes in logistics companies and nascent fintech firms that were the unsexy, essential arteries of the new economy. We weren't making headlines, we were building a fortress. Back home, Julian was making nothing but headlines. His visionary overhaul of the Blackwood Group began to show its cracks. The first quarterly report after my departure was met with unease. The second with outright alarm. He had been so focused on hoarding cash for his grand investments that he had starved the core business. The jewelry division, the historic heart of the Blackwood Empire, was bleeding. The managers he'd fired had taken decades of institutional knowledge with them. The divisions he'd shuttered had been responsible for steady, reliable revenue streams. I followed it all from my command center, the glow of multiple screens illuminating my face in the dark. The financial news channels, once fawning, now had a skeptical edge. Blackwood Group stalls as competitors expand, one headline read. "Is Julian Blackwood's conservative strategy a mask for cold feet?" asked another. The board, initially seduced by his bold promises, was growing restless. I knew this because Alexander Blackwood, Julian's older brother and my unlikely ally, had started sending me carefully worded emails. They were always under the guise of checking in on me, a polite inquiry about my well-being. But buried within the pleasantries were tidbits of information. "The old guard is growing impatient," one read. "Your foresight in avoiding the shares is looking wiser by the day." Alexander saw me as a useful tool, a scorned woman with insider knowledge who could help him undermine his brother. He had no idea he was playing a part in a script I was writing. The climax came during a live-streamed shareholder meeting. Julian, looking thinner and more tightly wound than I'd ever seen him, was halfway through a presentation full of buzzwords and grandiose projections when a major investor interrupted him. "Mr. Blackwood, you've spoken for 6 months about strategic positioning and future returns. Yet for 2 consecutive quarters we've seen contraction. You've poured capital into this Blackwood Ventures, and we have yet to see a single significant acquisition. You're paying management fees on idle funds while our core business withers. What, precisely, is the strategy here?" Julian's face, projected on the giant screen behind him, flushed a deep, mottled red. He didn't have a good answer. He couldn't say, I'm waiting for a biotech startup called Viridia to need a Series B round in 18 months, because in my past life, it was a 10-bagger. Instead he fell back on arrogance. The strategy is patience, he snapped, his voice cracking. A strategy this board seems to lack. You chase quarterly profits while I am building for the next decade. It was the wrong thing to say. The room erupted. Watching the live feed, I saw Alexander sitting calmly in the front row, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. He had hired a top consulting firm to investigate every single investment Julian had rejected. The report, I knew, was a damning indictment of missed opportunities. Cornered and humiliated, Julian did something reckless. Out of sheer spite, he announced he would prove his conviction. He was diverting the entire war chest of Blackwood Ventures into a single obscure private equity fund, the Pegasus Fund. I knew this fund. In our past life, it had been a dark horse, investing in a revolutionary water purification technology that would later explode in value. But that was 2 years away. In the present, the Pegasus Fund was small, unproven, and highly speculative. Pouring all their capital into it was a gamble of insane proportions. The financial world gasped. Blackwood Air bets the farm on unknown fund, the headlines screamed. The board panicked. Even his supporters saw it for what it was. Not a strategic masterstroke, but a tantrum. A few days after the meeting, I was having tea with my sister over video call. She was practically vibrating with schadenfreude. Have you heard? Julian went home after that meeting and apparently had a massive fight with Celeste. Threw a shoe at her, can you believe it? The little princess didn't take it well. He packed a bag, pregnant belly and all, and flew to Japan. Posted some cryptic message on social media. If no one invites me home, then I won't come back. I took a slow sip of my jasmine tea, savoring the floral notes. How do you know all the details, Lena? Do you have a spy under their bed? She laughed. One of my clients told me. I saved him a ton of money on a deal and he had a few too many drinks. Couldn't stop talking. Your client? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Alexander Blackwood, she said, her eyes widening with the thrill of the gossip. I didn't react. Of course it was Alexander. The threads of my plan were pulling tighter. My fund, with its government subsidies and impressive, though private, early returns, had attracted his attention. He'd invested a significant sum, no doubt seeing it as both a smart financial move and a way to indirectly fund the war against his brother. He had no idea the fund manager he so admired was the same man I had strategically installed. The news kept getting worse for Julian. The nightmare of our past life was repeating itself, but in a different, more accelerated key. His obsessive focus on avoiding the specific pitfalls he remembered had made him blind to new ones. Lawsuits from the abruptly cancelled projects began to pile up. Penalty fees mounted. The company's cash flow, which he had been so proud of hoarding, was now draining away to pay for his mistakes. I heard through the grapevine that the CFO, a steady man who had been with the company for 30 years, finally resigned in disgust, throwing his resignation letter on Julian's desk. You want to know why we're broke? He was reported to have shouted. I told you we needed controls. Penalty fees aren't monopoly money, you idiot. Julian was trapped. The Pegasus Fund, his great hope, was a long-term play. He needed liquidity now. But private equity isn't a stock you can sell with a click. Exiting required finding buyers, and in a tightening economic climate, no one was interested in an unproven fund at the price he needed. It was then that my phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in months. Julian. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. And again. Finally, I answered, my voice a study in cool detachment. Julian. This is a surprise. His voice was ragged, stripped of all its former arrogance. Elara. I need to talk to you. It's important. Regarding business, he said quickly. A potential opportunity. I think it could be mutually beneficial. I knew what he wanted. He was desperate to offload his stake in the Pegasus Fund to raise cash. And he knew on some level that I had capital. The irony was exquisite. I'm rather busy, Julian. Please, he said, and the word was a strangled thing. I'm coming to Singapore. Just one meeting. I agreed with feigned reluctance. I had Anthony book a private dining room at the finest restaurant in Marina Bay. I instructed my team to prepare an offer for Julian's stake. An offer so low it was borderline predatory. This wasn't just business. This was the next act of the play. The night of the meeting I arrived early. I wore a simple, devastatingly expensive black sheath dress. I looked like what I was. A successful, unapproachable suit. When Julian was shown into the room, the change in him was shocking. The stubble on his chin, the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. The charming, entitled air was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollowed-out shell. He wasn't alone. Anthony Anson was with me, as was his wife, Angela. Their presence was a deliberate choice, a display of my new power base. Julian's face froze when he saw me. But it was the presence of Anthony that truly rattled him. In our past life he had seen tabloid photos of me near Anthony's daughter's school and had accused me of playing stepmom to advance my career. He had looked at me with utter disgust and said, "That guy has 2 kids and you're still throwing yourself at him for money. You're truly shameless." Now he had to sit across the table and watch as Angela, sharp and perceptive, smiled warmly at me. "Our Miss Vance is such a workaholic," she said, her tone light but her eyes knowing. "If not for this acquisition I wouldn't even get a chance to have dinner with her. Mr. Blackwood, you sure were lucky once upon a time." Julian couldn't even muster a smile. He was forced to sit there and explain his failing assets to the very man he had once vilified. His eyes kept darting to me, full of a bewildered, dawning horror. As the dinner concluded and Anthony and Angela excused themselves, Julian finally turned to me, his voice a low, frantic whisper. "You've been reborn too, haven't you?" he asked, his eyes searching mine for a truth I would never give him. "I want to talk. Maybe we did have a lot of misunderstandings. Can you give me a chance?" I gave him a polite, icy smile. "It's not your fault, Julian. When you think everything is dirty, of course all women look dirty to you. But I'm here to make money," I said, my gaze sweeping over him with deliberate disdain, "not to recycle trash." I had instructed my team to push the valuation to rock bottom. The final signing was set for the Blackwood Group's boardroom. Before the meeting, Julian cornered me privately, almost begging. "You know this investment will succeed, don't you?" he pleaded. "You know in 2 years it will pay off. Please, for old time's sake, speak up for me in front of the chairman. Adam's projects are doomed. I can give you anything. Stock. I'll give you the stock I held back in the divorce." I looked at him, this man who had rewritten our history to cast himself as the victim. I thought of the ultrasound photo, of his whispered phone calls with Celeste, of the 10 years he had erased with a single self-serving narrative. "Your brother's not going down," I said calmly, pulling out the equity transfer agreement my lawyer had prepared. "I helped him avoid half of those ticking time bombs. Consider it repayment for helping me tidy things up so neatly." His eyes widened in shock. He finally understood. This wasn't bad luck. It was a calculated dismantling. "Because of Celeste?" he stammered, still clinging to his distorted reality. "Is it because you still have feelings for me?" The narcissism was breathtaking. I didn't answer. I simply pushed open the conference room door and walked in to formally acquire his failed dream at a fire sale price, sealing his financial ruin under the stony gaze of his own family. The signing in the Blackwood Group boardroom was a silent, brutal affair. The air was thick with the scent of old money and fresh humiliation. The board members, men in impeccably tailored suits whose families had been intertwined with the Blackwoods for generations, looked at me with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. They had underestimated the nobody Julian had cast aside. Now I held the keys to a portion of their future purchased for pennies on the dollar. Julian sat across the vast mahogany table, his posture rigid. He signed the documents transferring his stake in the failing Pegasus Fund to Ethelred Holdings with a hand that trembled slightly. Each scratch of his pen was the sound of his empire crumbling. He kept shooting me glances, his eyes a turbulent sea of confusion, anger, and a pathetic, lingering hope. He still believed on some level that this was a twisted test, that my coldness masked a love I was too proud to show. I met his gaze only once, my own expression as unreadable as a sphinx. There was no triumph in my eyes, only a profound, glacial finality. The message was clear. This was not a lover's quarrel. This was a business transaction. He was the bad investment I was cutting loose. As I stood to leave, the chairman, a frail man in his 80s who had been a friend of Julian's grandfather, spoke. "Miss Vance. A surprising turn of events. We wish you well in your endeavors." The dismissal was polite, but it was a dismissal. I was an outsider who had profited from their distress. They wanted me gone. I simply nodded. Thank you, sir. Ethelred looks forward to a profitable future. I walked out of that room without a backward glance, my lawyer flanking me. The heavy door clicked shut behind us and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that had been there for 2 lifetimes. It was done. Financially, Julian was neutered. But the game wasn't over. A man like Julian could always cling to the wreckage of his reputation. He still had his name, his damaged but still recognizable public persona as the tragic hero who had loved and lost. That was the final pillar that needed to be shattered. In the weeks that followed, Julian's pestering calls began again. They were no longer about business. They were desperate, rambling monologues filled with regret and self-pity. He was like a ghost haunting his own life, unable to move on from the script he had written, now that I was refusing to play my part. According to Alexander, who seemed to take a ghoulish delight in keeping me informed, Celeste was in Japan recovering from the birth of their son. She was spending money extravagantly and Julian, his resources drained, could no longer afford to fund her exile. The cracks in their fairy tale were widening into chasms. Celeste, it seemed, was growing impatient. I chose my moment with the precision of a surgeon. I agreed to meet Julian one last time. I suggested a quiet, open-air cafe known for its privacy, but I made sure to request a specific table. One nestled in a secluded bower visible from the street through a gap in the hedges. When he arrived, the change was even more pronounced. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt. The shadows under his eyes were like bruises. The arrogant air was completely gone, replaced by a broken man. Elara, he began, his voice raw. I regret everything. I know you'll never forgive me, but I need to tell you, back then in our past life, you worked yourself to the bone for me. How could I have believed those stories? How could I have been so blind? He reached across the table, his fingers brushing my hand. I forced myself not to flinch. I wish I'd never been reborn. I wish I could have just stayed in that time when you still loved me. This was my cue. I lowered my head, pinching the soft skin of my palm hard beneath the table. The sharp pain made my eyes water. I let a single, perfect tear trace a path down my cheek. I had always been so strong in front of him. The sight of my vulnerability broke the last of his defenses. He grabbed my hand, his grip tight. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Everything I've done, I deserve this. He was crying now, real tears of self-pity. Celeste, she still has some investments under her name. In 2 years that money will multiply tenfold. We can take it. Let's just leave. Let's go to Europe, just the 2 of us. We can start over. There's still a chance for us. The audacity was staggering. Even now, at his absolute nadir, he was planning to steal from the mother of his child and run away with his ex-wife. He was a moral vacuum. I had rehearsed this moment. I pulled my hand back slowly, making sure the gesture was filmed by the long lens camera I knew was positioned across the street. I let my voice tremble, layering it with a heartbreak that was both real and performative. Of course you deserve this, Julian, I whispered, the words carrying on the summer breeze. Anyone who tramples on someone's heart deserves to be pierced 1,000 times. Saying it aloud in this context felt cleansing. The heavy weight on my chest, the residue of a lifetime of betrayal, finally felt like it was dissolving. Then I picked up my glass of ice water. I looked past Julian's shoulder toward the gap in the hedge. I made eye contact with the lens I knew was there. And with all the force of my pent-up fury, I flung the glass not at him, but at the window of the cafe behind him. The shattering crash was spectacular. It drew the attention of every patron, every server. And right on cue, as if summoned by the sound, a figure emerged from the shadows near the entrance. It was Celeste. She looked pale and thin, still carrying the softness of recent childbirth. But her eyes burned with a fury that was anything but fragile. She wasn't alone. Clustered behind her like a pack of well-dressed hyenas were a dozen celebrity gossip reporters, their audio recorders and cameras already rolling. Julian Fong, she screamed, her voice cracking with a pain that was terrifyingly authentic. What the hell are you doing? Julian spun around, his face a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. Celeste stormed toward our table, collapsing dramatically to her knees on the floor, as if the weight of her anguish was too much to bear. I gave birth to your child. I flew back the moment I could, and this is how you greet me? crawling back to your ex-wife like a damn dog. She looked directly into the nearest camera, her face a tragic mask. Julian Blackwood, you'll never get away with this. The scene was chaos. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions. The cafe manager was trying to restore order. Julian was stammering, trying to form words, but he was utterly, completely exposed. The narrative unfolded online in real time. The photos were damning. Me tear-streaked and recoiling from his touch. Him desperate and pleading. Celeste, the betrayed mother, crumpled on the floor. The headlines wrote themselves. Blackwood heir's sordid love triangle erupts in public. Celeste Devereaux. I had his baby, he left me for his ex. The harassment of Alara Vance. A victim's story. The carefully constructed image of Julian Blackwood, the visionary, the tragic lover, evaporated in an instant. He was now just a cheating, lying, pathetic man who harassed his ex-wife while the mother of his newborn child begged for scraps. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The jewelry line he still nominally oversaw, whose customer base was predominantly women, saw a mass boycott. The hashtag dump Blackwood trended for days. His remaining allies on the board abandoned him. Alexander, with the cold efficiency of a seasoned predator, moved in for the kill. Within a week, Julian was formally ousted from the Blackwood Group. The family, to protect what was left of their name, publicly disowned him. He was left with nothing. No job, no reputation, no family, and crucially, as he was about to discover, no money. Because Celeste, my silent partner from the very beginning, had already moved. The investments he had spoken of? The ones under her name that were supposed to multiply? Half were securely in a trust for their son. The other half had been quietly transferred to an account controlled by Ethelred Holdings. The final pawn had been moved. Checkmate. The silence in my Singapore penthouse was no longer that of escape, but of victory. It was a deep, resonant quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the city far below, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my freedom. The news feeds, once a source of such visceral pain, were now a scrolling testament to Julian's utter annihilation. The media, having milked the scandal dry, had moved on, leaving his reputation as a desiccated husk on the side of the road. My sister Lena FaceTimed me, her face a mosaic of exhilaration and lingering fury. It's over. It's really over. Alexander made it official. Julian's been stripped of everything. Even their parents have cut him off. He's finished. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But Alara, why? Why did you help her? That woman. She's the definition of shameless. You should have let the public roast her until she couldn't show her face in this industry again. On the screen she couldn't see the subtle shift in my expression. She saw only the final public act of the drama. My PR teams carefully placed articles that painted Celeste as a victim who had found her strength. The headlines had a certain poetic flair. Celeste Devereaux rises from the ashes. No more golden cages. And the final line, the one that had truly set the gossip world alight. Her new boss? None other than her former rival, the formidable Alara Vance, who has publicly welcomed her to a comeback under the Ethelred media banner. To the outside world, it looked like an astonishing act of female solidarity, or a deeply cynical business move. To Lena it looked like insanity. Oh sister, I said, a faint, knowing smile touching my lips. If only it were that simple. How could I explain the truth? How could I articulate the surreal reality of reincarnation, of a shared past life, to my pragmatic, fiercely loyal sister? The truth was a locked box and only Celeste and I held the key. The memory of Celeste's first visit was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. It was a week after the wedding rumors had broken, but before Julian had delivered the divorce papers. I was still reeling, still playing the part of the blindsided bride. She had shown up at my penthouse unannounced, her face pale under a large hat and sunglasses. When she took the glasses off I saw it. Not the cunning of a mistress, but the hollowed-out terror of a prey animal. She was young, far younger than she seemed on screen, and her eyes held a pain that was ancient. Miss Vance, she'd begun, her voice trembling. You have no reason to believe me. But at 19 I didn't know anything. He drugged me at a party. He took my body without my consent, and I was the one left with a ruined reputation. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through her expertly applied makeup. I knelt and I begged him to just let me leave the country to disappear forever. But he wouldn't. He said I was his. He forced me to get an abortion. He never once treated me like a human being. She looked at me then, and in her gaze I saw not an enemy but a reflection. A fellow prisoner in the gilded prison of Julian Blackwood's ego. Heaven must have taken pity on me for wasting an entire lifetime, she whispered, echoing the very thought that had been haunting me. This time, she said, her voice hardening into a blade of pure resolve, I will protect my baby. Please, Miss Vance. I have nothing left. If you help me get revenge, let me be your blade. And so, the most unlikely of alliances was forged in the fires of our shared secret history. The plan was hers as much as it was mine. It was she who suggested we leak the story of Julian's past pursuit of her. It was she who, with the help of the assistant I had placed in Julian's office, made sure she was a constant, tantalizing presence in his life. At charity galas, at industry events, a ghost of the true love he thought he remembered. We made him believe it was fate, a second chance to correct the mistakes of a past he completely misunderstood. He helped me destroy him. And I, in turn, gave her what she truly wanted, a path out. Not as a mistress, not as a kept woman, but as her own person. Ethelred Media was her vehicle. I would fund her comeback, not as an actress chasing male approval, but as a producer, a creator. She would have control. She would have her son. No more cages. No more being at the mercy of a man's whims. The truth is, Lena, I said, choosing my words carefully, Celeste was never the enemy. She was just another one of his victims. And a very useful one. Lena stared at me, her mind visibly working to recalibrate her entire understanding of the last 6 months. So, all of it? The public fights? The trip to Japan? The dramatic confrontation? All part of the script, I confirmed, my voice calm. A script we wrote together. The final beautiful irony was the money. Julian, in his desperation at the cafe, had blurted out the truth about the investments under Celeste's name. He had been telling the truth about that. The Pegasus Fund, the one he had been forced to sell to me, was indeed destined for greatness. But he never got the chance to see it. The shares he had so generously put in Celeste's name? They were now safe. Half in a trust for their son, the other half seamlessly integrated into the growing portfolio of Ethelred Holdings. Julian had been evicted from the Blackwood family with nothing, and he didn't even know that the last remnants of his fortune were funding the empire of the woman he had betrayed and the blade he had created. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The skyline of Singapore sprawled before me, a forest of steel and ambition. It was my forest now. Ethelred was no longer just a fund. It was a multi-pronged empire with holdings in finance, media, and technology. I had built it from the ashes of a broken heart and a stolen life. My phone buzzed on the glass table. A message from Anthony Anson. The final numbers for the quarter were in. The Pegasus Fund's first major investment, the water purification company, had just secured a landmark government contract. The value of the fund had doubled overnight. The very asset Julian had been forced to sell to save himself was now the crown jewel in my portfolio. I didn't feel vindication. I felt a profound, settled peace. The ghost of Julian Blackwood had been exorcised. The phantom pains of a past life had finally ceased. Another message flashed. This one was from Celeste. It was a photo of her son, a chubby-cheeked baby with a shock of dark hair, laughing. The caption was simple, "Thank you. For everything." I looked from the photo of the innocent child to the skyline of my hard-won kingdom, and then back at my sister's puzzled, concerned face on the screen. "So what now?" Lena asked, her voice soft. "Now, Lena," I said, a genuine, untroubled smile finally spreading across my face, "we live. Really live." I had been given a second chance, not for revenge but for rebirth. The revenge was simply the necessary fire that cleared the ground. And from that scorched earth I had risen, not as a wife, not as a victim, but as a Lara Vance. Architect of my own fate. The game was over. My life had finally begun. The end.